Last year, I explored an alternate history version of the 40k universe, one that I'd created myself. In it, I posed the question of what if Angron, as an infant, had found himself raised by orcs rather than in the gladiatorial pits of Nuceria. In that video, I asked for suggestions of other ways Primarchs could have had a vastly different upbringing, and a few of you suggested Konrad Curze and the Eldar. Not only would this give me an interesting aesthetic to explore, but with Curze's powers of premonition, it also had an avenue of believability. So join me as I ask the question, what if Konrad Curze was raised by the Eldar? Now, I'm not going to go too much into the fluff of this model here, we're going to go straight into the build, but if you are interested in hearing about the background that I've cooked up for this Eldari raised Konrad Curze, or Korum-Tainn as I've named him, then I'll include that at the end of this video, so stick around until the end. In my past Konrad Curze video, I used the Lionel Johnson plastic kit as a basis for the conversion, and in this video I'm doing the exact same. Now this might seem a little uninspired, but there are some good reasons for this. Number 1. Scale. Non-demonic Primarch scale plastic kits are quite thin on the ground. We have the obvious choices like Guilliman and the Lion, along with Sigvald the Magnificent. There are also a few other slightly larger options, such as Seal-esque and Catacross, who I've used in my previous Sanguinius build. Number 2. Aesthetics. While there are a few options in regards to the scale, none of these choices truly fit into the dynamic of a Farseer Primarch hybrid, with the exception of the Lion kit. The long flowing robes and cape would simply fit into the Eldar aesthetic much more easily. And number 3, it's my channel. If I want to make every single video based around Lionel Johnson kit, then I will. You know what, maybe I should. That's right, every 2 weeks, a new Lionel Johnson kit bash. Welcome to the Lionel Johnson kit bash channel, it's lined all the way down. Watch me kit bash this Lionel Johnson, another Lionel Johnson. But before we continue working on that Eldar Curze, let's hear from the sponsors of this video, War Thunder. If you've seen any of my bolt action videos, then you'll already be aware I've always had an interest in military history, which means that a game like War Thunder is right up my street. In it, you'll get to take control over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and even ships of 10 major nations from the 1920s through to the modern day. War Thunder runs great, even if you don't have the latest hardware, thanks to its optimized Daegor engine. You don't need any extra equipment either, as you can take control of those tanks, ships, and aircraft with just a mouse and a keyboard or a controller. War Thunder can be played on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox. It is even available on iOS and Android mobile devices, so now you can play wherever you go, and best of all, it's free to play. And regardless of what kind of game mode you're in the mood for, War Thunder has you covered. If you're looking for fast-paced action, then jump into arcade. If it's hardcore realism that you're after, then try out simulator mode. And if you want a balanced experience, then give realism a go. One of my favorite things about War Thunder is the level of detail that is depicted in its vehicles. Seeing historic tanks, ships, and aircraft accurately modeled down to their engines, fuel tanks, and even their crew is just amazing. Even the damage is realistic. If you get hit, you'll see exactly how your vehicle is affected with an X-ray view that shows you where the shell penetrated and what caused the destruction. Plus, you can fully customize your vehicles with camouflages, historical markings, and even more. So, if you want to join over 70 million players in epic battles across PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and even on mobile, then use my links in the pinned comment and description below. If you're a new player or someone who hasn't played on PC or console in the last 6 months, you can grab yourself a bonus pack, which includes premium vehicles, the exclusive Eagle of Valor Decorator, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of premium account access. But hurry, it's a limited time offer. So, after clipping away the parts needed to build the lion from the sprue, I cleaned up the pieces by removing any sprue tabs and mold lines. Before I could do anything with the parts though, I first had to remove any and all of the Imperial iconography from the armor and the cloak. This was quite extensive and was approached very carefully. By first using my knife, I shaved away the detailing before using a combination of my knife and some fine grit sandpaper to gradually smooth out and reshape the armor. The same process was performed across the edging on the cloak too. With quite a flowing curved surface, the sandpaper was particularly useful here as the flat edge of the knife gave me some difficulty in smoothing out a few of the areas. Continuing with the prep, I also clipped away part of the power pack mount from the back in order to flatten out the surface. This would allow me to attach something a little different later on, and with this done, I could assemble the legs. However, it was at this point in the build that I realised the various rivets dotted across the armour also didn't fit into that AELDARI aesthetic, and so these were also removed and flattened. From here, I continued to assemble the torso whilst also removing a few extra details on the cape that lay across the shoulders. Normally, these areas would have been covered by large shoulder pads, but as I didn't plan on using these, I would have to recreate and rebuild the cloak myself, which I ultimately achieved with some sculpting. For this task, I settled on a combination of green stuff and milliput. Green stuff alone is great for things like fabric and organic surfaces, but by adding in a small amount of milliput in a 3 parts green stuff to 1 part milliput ratio, I created a substance that could be sanded and filed once cured. This mixture was then rolled out into strips, which were laid in a parallel across the shoulders. I then blended each of these out into a crease and a fold. During this process, I made sure to add a little Vaseline to my tools and fingers just to prevent the putty from sticking to them and to give me a smoother finish. While the putty was still soft, I added my first Eldar parts. These armor plates were taken from the Wraithguard kit and would allow me to mimic the shoulder armor seen on Farseers. I gently pressed these into place, deforming the putty around them. I cleaned up the creases a little and left everything to cure and harden overnight. With everything cured, I could start to clean up the creases in the putty. I approached this in the same way that I tackled the removal of the iconography, but first I removed the shoulder pads. These were only lightly attached, so popped off easily. My aim with this step was to smooth out the surfaces so that their texture matched the plastic around them, sharpen the creases out to make them easy to highlight, and also blend the putty back into the cloak. Once I was happy with the finish, I superglued the shoulder pads back into place. With the cloak in place, my attention turned towards Konrad's weaponry. For his right arm, a weapon swap would be fairly straightforward, but his left arm would be a little trickier. While Eldar do use shields, theirs are quite different from the one equipped by the Lion. So, to remedy this, I began with a Grey Knight Terminator left arm, which I cut away at the forearm from. After trimming and smoothing both the arm and the Lion's elbow joint, I was able to glue the arm along with a Grey Knight open hand. The shield was taken from the Wraithguard kit, and after a little more trimming and adjusting, this was also glued into place. And Konrad was now ready to... For the sword, I kept the original hand and handle, but removed the actual blade, crossguard, and pommel. After a cleanup, I then removed the blade from a Wraithguard sword too. But to attach this new blade to the arm, I didn't rely solely upon glue, which across a small area would be pretty fragile. Instead, I used my pin vise to drill a 1mm hole into both the blade and into the hand, just a few millimeters deep. Into one of these holes, I superglued a piece of steel 1mm wire and glued the two parts together, creating a much stronger bond. The sword was then finished off with a canister that I liberated from a Wraithguard axe, cleaned up and glued to where the pommel used to be. With both arms in place, I could focus on how I would approach the head. Now, even though this wasn't my first modification to the miniature, it was actually this that cemented the idea of the build for me. Whilst I was planning this out and exploring if this was even feasible, it wasn't until I compared a Wraithguard head against the body of my previous Konrad Curze build that I knew for sure that I would pursue this miniature. And that was mainly because the size of the helmet is almost perfectly scaled for a Primarch, giving the appearance of a Farseer or Spirit Seer style helmet. But before I could attach the helmet, I first had to flatten out the point in the centre of the gorget. In order to attach the head to the torso, I kept things fairly straightforward and simply borrowed the neck of one of the lion's heads. I picked the hoodless, helmetless head and compared my Wraithguard head against it. This gave me the rough idea of what angle I needed to cut the neck at. After some trimming and comparisons, the lion's neck was glued to the underside of the helmet, but I didn't attach the head to the torso just yet. As I briefly mentioned earlier, I intended to replace the lion's power pack with one of the fins, which was, surprise surprise, also taken from the Wraithguard kit. After clipping and flattening one side, it was glued to the back where the power pack would normally be attached. By this point in the build, everything was in place, and I could focus on some of the more decorative details. The first of these were some strips of fabric that would hang down across the chest. I created these from some Wraithguard tabards, but I first had to clip away the gem fastenings, which I kept to one side for now. After flattening out the top edge and rear of the fabric, I then glued both strips to the chest just below the cloak. Those gems that I'd removed were then cleaned up and superglued to the cloak either side of the clasp. In order to give the armour more of an Eldar feel, I next set about recreating the bumps that are seen on Eldari miniatures. Sometimes these are interpreted as gems, other times they're just bumps. Either way, I began by mixing up more milliput and green stuff. Once mixed, I then rolled out small spheres and pressed them onto the armour. Using my tools, I carefully shaped the putty into a gem shape. Now once these dry, if you're planning on using the model for gaming purposes, I would recommend removing the gems and then supergluing them back into place, just to ensure that they don't fall off later on. And finally, I attached an Eldar part that wasn't from the Wraithguard kit, including some equipment taken from the Guardian's kit. This was attached to the belt where there would normally be a pistol holster. With the model built, I could now turn my attention to the base. I went with the scenic base that came with the model, albeit without the watches. To help blend the rocks and rubble into the base, I also superglued a few cork chunks along with some skulls for some extra detail. The model itself though was kept separate, and I instead attached it to a small base and added a pin to the head to make both easy to hold during painting. I began the painting with a primer, and I chose a black airbrush primer for this. As I planned on painting my Eldari Konrad in the colours of Ulthwe, a black primer made the most sense. However, I didn't go straight ahead and start painting the model just yet. I first painted on a layer of Doom Death Black from the Tooth and Cones range across the whole model. This might seem superfluous as the primer was already black, but the shade of black paint is slightly different from the primer coat. This would mean that, should I need to clean up any overspills or mistakes, the black paint of Doom Death Black may have been visible against the primer. This just avoided that future problem. With the primer and black paint dry, I then began painting the iconic bone colouring of Ulthwe by starting out with some Griffon Claw. I used my airbrush to paint the helmet and sword, using a glove to protect the rest of the model from overspill. Any areas that couldn't be easily reached with my airbrush were then painted with a regular brush instead. I added a little water to my mix and painted the Griffon Claw on in 2 thin layers, allowing ample time for the paint to dry between applications. With the Griffon Claw base coat in place, my next goal was to help darken down some of those recessed areas, which I achieved with some Archaic Sepia wash. For the helmet, I lightly airbrushed this along the bottom edge of the helmet before using my brush to apply the wash to the sword and other small details. I then followed this up with some Ivory Tusk. For the helmet, I first used my airbrush to create a lighter gradient emanating from the centre of the dome, before using the same paint to pick out all the hard edges using this lighter bone colour. This highlight was pushed even further with some small dots of Trooper White. These were focused onto the corners and sharper points of the edges as more of an extreme highlight. While the majority of the model's robes were black, I wanted some variation in colour, so I decided to tackle the inner robe with a nice rich blue of the appropriately named Eldar Robe. This was also a nice nod to Konrad's original Night Lord colours. Rather than applying a wash to darken the recesses, I instead took some of the darker Abyss Blue and used a little water to thin it out. This mixture was then painted into the creases and recesses of the robes, where it steadily darkened them down, helping to create the appearance of shadows. The edges of the robe were then highlighted with Relic Blue, before being picked out with a few small spots of Seafarer Blue on the sharpest points. With the non-black areas tackled, I then cleaned up any overspills with some more Doom Death Black. While most of the model would be black, I did want to create some variation between the two materials, so I decided to paint the cloth differently from the armour. For the remaining robes and the cloak, I created an initial highlight mixture of Dungeonstone Grey and Doom Death Black. This mixture was quite subtle against the black, and I used this to pick out the larger folds in the cloth. For the more familiar thin line edge highlight, I instead created a much lighter mix of Dungeonstone Grey and Twin Suns Yellow. This was used to pick out all of the edges with a thin line. A little more Twin Suns Yellow was then added to my mix and was painted on as an extreme highlight. While the cloth was highlighted with a warmer grey, I decided to approach the armour with a grey blue instead. For this task, I settled on some Faust Blue and highlighted all of the armor's many edges. I continued with the highlights with some shadow blue, but unlike last time, I only focused my application to the upper edges of the armor. This just helped to bring out the detail of these points a little more, whilst also simulating how light would naturally fall onto these areas. The armor was then finished off with an extreme highlight of Faust Blue. For the leather belt, I started out with a base coat of Scorched Earth, highlighted it with Ancient Forest, and then finally Wasteland Brown. To paint all of the soul stones dotted across the armor and weapons, I base coated them with some Amphora Red. Now, to create the effect of a gem, I painted an L shape of Emperoer Red onto the bottom left of each gem, keeping the darker Amphora Red in the top right. Using some Centurion Red, I then repeated the L shape, but focused even more towards the bottom left, creating a kind of gradient where it darkened as it moved towards the upper right. To help unify the previous colours whilst also boosting the vibrancy of the colour, I then coated the gems with a very small amount of the contrast paint Doomfire Magenta. And finally, for the upper right of each gem, I then carefully placed 2 small dots of Trooper White to create the effect of a reflection on a glossy surface. The model was still lacking in Eldar iconography though. Fortunately, this could be fixed with the application of some decals, but before I could apply any, I first gave the surfaces a coat of gloss varnish. This has a dual effect of protecting my paintwork, whilst also giving me a smoother surface in which to place the transfer on. I sourced the decals from the AELDARI transfer sheet and cut away a few of the Farseer and Spiritseer related icons before leaving them to soak in some water for a little while. Once they were lifting away from the backing paper, I used a dampened brush to gently slide the transfers onto the model, and while they were still damp, I adjusted their position before leaving them to dry. Once they had dried, I then applied a few layers of Microsol. This softens the transfer and allows it to more easily adhere to the curved surfaces I applied the transfers to. I applied a couple of layers of this, allowing each layer to dry fully before applying more. Once everything had dried, I then sealed the decals into place with a coat of matte varnish. However, the decals on the robe didn't quite look right. The parts that sat in the folds were a little too bright, and so I created another glaze, this time of Doom Death Black, and targeted this into those recesses. This darkened the decal down and the points where shadows would naturally form, helping to blend them more into the model. With the model itself complete, I then began painting the base. For the broken statue and the rocks, I started out with some field grey, before giving them a coat of Oblivion black wash. They were then highlighted first with some Ranger Cloak, and finally a few spots of Kobold Grey. In order to fill in the gaps between the rocks, I turned to a combination of dark earth and playground texture paste. These were applied across the base and blended together to create a predominantly brown earthy surface, albeit with a few spots of green moss. After being allowed to fully dry, the texture paste was given a coat of Oblivion black, before I picked out that raised texture with a dry brush of Dust Bowl. For the various skulls dotted around the base, I simply repeated the same steps that I'd used earlier across the bone details on the Primarch. With the painting complete, the entirety of the model was given a coat of matte varnish to help reduce the glossiness, whilst also protecting the paintwork. And with the varnish in place, I could remove the parts from their temporary holders, scrape clean the contact points, and assemble the parts together. The base was then finalised with some moss patches and grass tufts, and I was finally left with this. And here we have the completed AELDARI raised Primarch Korum-Tainn. My goal with this build was to tread that fine line between human and AELDARI aesthetics without leaning too far into either direction. The result is something that is clearly of the Eldar at first glance, but the bulkier frame and taller stature betray the idea that this is in fact a human Primarch. Now, while I'm extremely happy with the finished model, I think that including a little more Eldar iconography could have helped to improve things. A few symbols, trinkets, and even a few more decals may have helped to better mask the line's armour, but I do think that the embedded soulstones make up for that shortcoming. Now, as mentioned in the beginning of this video, this is the second entry into my own alternate version of the 40k universe, one where the infant Primarchs were found and raised among alien societies and were never recovered. A timeline where humanity wasn't split by a great heresy and is still led by the Emperor and his remade Thunder Warriors. In this universe, the Xenos races take centre stage, bolstered by their adopted Primarchs. As such, if you have any ideas or suggestions for which Xenos races the Primarchs found themselves a part of, then leaving them down in the comments below. This very idea of an Eldar Konrad Curze came from one of those suggestions, and I'd love to do more. Now, as always, if you'd like to recreate any conversions from this video, I will include links to all the kits and paints used in this video down in the description below, including where you can pick up my own Dead Animal Bits kit. And once again, thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Remember, you can play it for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and even on mobile. Just use those links below to get premium vehicles, the exclusive Eagle of Valor Decorator, 100,000 Silver Lions, and 7 days of premium account access if you're a new player or haven't played in the last 6 months across PC or console. But hurry, it's only available for a limited time, so don't miss out. But before I go, let me just say a huge thank you to everyone who continues to help keep this channel going. And if you'd like to support me too, you can get early access to ad-free videos, exclusive merchandise, and even your name in the credits. Simply follow my Patreon link below or hit the join button. Just like my top Patreon supporters did, who are Nail5, Axel Jonsson, Ben Jevrian, Berserker, Dakota Gaburi, Daniel Dowling, George Kanzini Roberts, Immaterial Creations, Cornbread, Matt Savitsky, Matt Brower, Molly Mork, Mr. Grimm, Nima, Older Than Time, Pale Juice, Ryan Little, Sam Sepulveda, Swedsman, Tim, and Warnovis. And my top channel members who are AM, Alex Verne, Dave, Doug H, Guy Bizant, Kutch Kato, Lil Illy, Mark Taylor, Nerdington Paints, Omni Tom, Philip Hoyer, SO, Satoran, That One Tech Priest, The City of Cryas, The Sire Acquired, and Whale Tussler. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye. So thank you for sticking around until the end of the video, and as promised, here's my background for how Konrad Curze found himself among the Eldar. Now, word of warning, I'm not a writer, this is just something that I came up off the cuff, so do forgive any terrible writing, and I hope you enjoy it. Among the archivists of Ulthwe, there is some disagreement on precisely how Korum-Tainn came to be. There are some who believe he was a result of some elaborate plan hatched by Kegorak and his Harlequin followers, a mere playing piece in the Laughing God's greater schemes. Others see him as a manifestation of the Eldari's twilight, a harbinger of Yenneed who will usher in the final defeat of Slaanesh. These are the outlying theories though, with most scholars agreeing that Korum-Tainn is not a product of the higher powers and simply a barely tolerable instrument to further their people's cause. Ultimately, there is only one who knows the full truth of Korum-Tainn's origins, the Farseer who found and raised him, Aldrad Ulthran. For it was he who saw the creation of the Primarchs by the Emperor of Mankind and their subsequent scattering across the cosmos. It was he who sensed the gift that one of those sons possessed and the potential to help his dwindling race. And so, with the assistance of a troop of Harlequins, Aldrad was able to pluck the infant from the warp and return with him to Ulthwe. While a respected figure among Eldari society, Aldrad knew that bringing in a human, no matter how powerful, would be viewed with disgust by many. His only choice was to raise the child, who he had named Oran, in secret, biding his time until his worth could be revealed. Under the tutelage and guidance of Aldrad and his most trusted inner circle of friends and allies, Uran was raised as an Eldari. While he soon grew far taller and stronger than even the most statuesque Eldari, his grace and martial prowess proved even a match for the Phoenix Lords themselves. But where his true power lay was his ability of farsight. At first, these uncontrolled visions haunted the child's mind, but over time he came to wield them as effectively as he could a blade. After long years of guidance, Uran was finally given the chance to reveal himself to his adopted people. During a particularly tumultuous period within the Eye of Terror, a great demonic host descended upon Ulthwe. While the Craft World was adept at resisting these incursions, this force appeared not only larger, but more purposeful in their attacks. Soon, the defenders found themselves overwhelmed by the foul hordes and scattered into disparate clusters of resistance. It was at this point that a figure appeared on the battlefield, seemingly from nowhere. Clad in the blackened bone of Ulthwe and standing at almost twice the height of most Eldar, the lone individual strode effortlessly through the massed ranks of demons. Even as blades, claws, and balefire swirled around him, the figure remained unharmed, easily deflecting or sidestepping the blows as they came, all the while the corporeal forms of the demons were torn asunder with the arching sweeps of his blade. Seizing this opportunity, the Aeldari rallied, and soon the demonic hordes were being held at bay. Guided by the lone figure, the fighters seemed to always be exactly where they were needed most, ready to counter the chittering hordes with mass shuriken gun lines, or bringing down monstrous beasts with focused battery fire. Before long, the locuses of the ravaging hordes were destroyed, and the demons were pulled back to the warp from which they came, leaving only the shattered Aeldari behind. It was in the wake of this hard-fought victory that Aldrad finally revealed his secret to his world. Even in the light of this great deed, there were many who condemned Aldrad's actions, viewing Oren as an abomination, or, by the sympathetic among them, a simple pet. But not all agreed. Those present during that hard-fought battle had dubbed him Korum-Tainn, or Hunter Spirit. They saw him as a spectre who seemingly appeared from nowhere to bring swift retribution to those who threatened their world. Bearing his new name, Korum-Tainn remains a divisive figure among Eldari society. While respected by those treading the warrior paths and almost revered by those who fight alongside him, Korum-Tainn is still not truly accepted as a member of the Eldari, an outcast among the only people he has ever known. Aldrad is aware and deeply troubled by this. He always has been, for it was he who saw the creation of the Primarchs, and it is he who saw their downfall. So again, thank you very much for sticking around to the end of that. I hope it kind of clears up some of the rough background that I've come up with to explain who Korum-Tainn is and how a Konrad Curze could be raised by the Eldar and what the result would be. So anyway, thank you very much for sticking around to the end and putting up with my ramblings, and I hope to see you again in the next one. Once again, thanks for watching, and goodbye.